Believe in authority, I believe in myself, baby, I'm an anarchist.
Welcome to another Circle Day show with me, Yadette Gerez. You're tuned in to Resonance 104.4 FM. Joining me is Sophie Scott Brown. There are many misconceptions about anarchism, and we will delve deep into the subject matter. Sophie is a modern intellectual historian and philosopher specialising in direct democracy. She's a fellow at the University of St Andrews in Scotland and a Mark Fellow at New York University and the former director of Gresham College. A regular speaker for the Institute of Arts and Ideas and the BBC Free Thinking programme, her current project illuminates transatlantic experiments in grassroots democracy among activist networks during the early Cold War. Her research laid the ground for revitalising liberational politics for a post-industrial world. Sophie is also a fellow of the Higher Education Academy and of the Royal History Society. She is an inspiring intellectual historian with research interest in modern European political thought, anarchism, and the history of education. Her historical work on left-wing politics, especially the post-war British left, has earned her widespread recognition, as well as her intellectual biography of Raphael, a portrait of a people's historian. What is an anarchist mindset and free spirit, if one could essentially sum it up?
Well, that's a fantastic opening question. And thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. I'll just make one slight adjustment, which is not your fault. It's what's out there on the internet. And that is I'm a former lecturer at UEA. And at UEA, I taught philosophy, political philosophy, although there's plenty of history in it. So I think we could get away with some flexibility there. So what is an anarchist mindset? Straight to the chase. I like that because quite often people don't necessarily immediately think, anarchy is a mindset. It's still very much one of the isms for people. Like it's something that's not quite socialism. It's not quite liberalism. It's kind of confused. It's somewhere in between. But I mean, the way that I've always approached anarchism is first and foremost, it is a way of seeing the world. And to me, this works on two levels. First of all, it's like a critical lens. So what anarchy basically means, and first words don't always have to be the last word, but they're a good place to start. And anarchy is very simple. It means no rule. No rule, that's all it is. But from that very simple starting point, you kind of explode into kind of proliferation of different ideas and concepts and what have you. Starting from this idea of no rule, I think basically anarchism is kind of obsessed with power. It always wants to know where the power is in the room and what it's doing and how it's got there. So it's like if you turn an anarchist lens on anything, if you just look through that lens, then you're looking for where the power is and what it's doing. So straight up, it makes you just really critically alert to the world. Now, of course, as much as everyone loves to be critical, no one wants to go around on red alert all the time. That's kind of slightly depressing, maybe even a bit nihilistic. So the other thing anarchy does is it says, right, well, there are two ways to criticize, right? One is to confront power and call it out. And the second way is just to come up with so many alternatives that no one could possibly claim that there was ever one way or one pattern of doing things in life. So the anarchist mindset, the anarchist spirit for me, on the one hand, it's a critical confrontation with power. And on the other hand, it's an explosion into possibility. How's about that for a starting point?
Woohoo!
Woohoo!
You've written two books, Colin Ward and the Art of Everyday Anarchy, and the histories of Raphael, a portrait of a people's history. Let's start with how the Marxist historian Raphael is relevant to anarchist thinkers, and I in particular would love you to elaborate on how his role as a facilitator shows us that shaping the culture behind the scenes is a part of the story for liberation, and the process itself determines the outcome.
That's fantastic. I'm really glad you brought up Raphael. Actually, he tends to get kind of bumped out of the picture. People tend to focus more on the kind of explicitly anarchist elements in my work, the activists I've worked on, Colin Ward. But actually, Raphael was to me where it all started. I signed up for a PhD at the Australian National University, and initially it was going to be on something terribly sober and boring, such as British post-war historiography, the politics of. And in the process, I sort of fell over characters who will be quite familiar to probably most historians, working today. E.P. Thompson, big sort of cultural, those pioneering cultural historians. And within this, Catherine Hall, of course, a lot of them had come through this phenomenon called the History Workshop movement. And that the sort of behind the scenes of it all was this chap called Raph Samuel. And I just became so fascinated with what he was doing, because he was just incredibly hard to pin down. Here was someone who was ostensibly brought up, raised like a communist. He was a communist baby. He was raised in a communist household. He thought he was going to be a communist organizer. And then all of a sudden goes from that origin to being this unbelievably protean, creative, very mercurial figure who was so unbelievably inspiring to people. When I was doing oral interviews with his ex-students, when someone's been really touched by a teacher and it's still shining out of them, it was so powerful. So I was like, right, I need to understand this guy. And it turns out that he was one of life's great inventors. Whenever there was a problem, rather than simply complain about it, Raphael tended to invent a new kind of space or a new activity or a new forum. And the first thing he did was, so what happens basically, dedicated communist and what have you. And then in 1956, of course, there were tremors, there were issues, there were problems, there was sort of news coming out of the Soviet Union that was not all positive. But in 1956, the proverbial really hits the fan. You've got an absolutely perfect storm. First of all, you have the Khrushchev revelations in the February, which is basically when Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union leader, reveals the terrible realities of what happened under Stalin, and does this. It's sort of like the world's largest stage whisper. So he deliberately does it so the news travels out across the communist world. We can no longer pretend that Stalin was pursuing the Marxist dream. It was horrible, terrible, genocidal, awful. So there's that. And then, just in case you thought that that was some sort of moment for the Soviet Union to kind of resurrect itself, it then goes ahead and invades Hungary after there's been a popular uprising against the communist regime there. And the Soviet tanks roll into Budapest. And this is a completely, imagine Palestine, our moment right now, Palestine for so many young people right now. In 1956, Hungary was that generation's Palestine. It was so shocking. It was so disgusting. And that coming right alongside the Suez Canal crisis, which is where Britain, along with France and Israel, attempt to invade the Suez Canal region, which just showed that all this decolonization was nothing to them. And they were still incredibly imperial-minded government. This just left so many young people kind of with nowhere to turn, right? The left's not a solution. The government's not a solution. What do we do? So Raph and a group of his close friends, like people like Stuart Hall and Charles Taylor, they set up the First New Left. And the First New Left, what's really interesting about the First New Left is it does have an anarchic spirit, because it's no longer got any faith in parties or doctrines or kind of blueprints for the future. It wants to know what it means to be free right here, right now, and for the means, the way you bring about revolution to match how you want that revolution to, what you want it to lead to. So in a nutshell, that's why Raphael was just, he sort of, watching him actually not find the answers, but go through the problems and try and invent or create the solutions. What he was trying to do there was move away from a vision of democracy to saying, well, what does it mean when you concede the practice of it? What does it mean when instead of telling everyone this is what democracy should be, you actually treat them like they're your co-creators and your equals? And from there, it was a very short hop, skip and a jump to the anarchists.
Let's talk about Colin Ward. What would you say stood out about him when you commenced your research for the book?
Well, okay, and this is honestly true. What stands out most about Colin was that absolutely nothing stood out. What was so fascinating about Colin, he was so not your usual radical, right? There's no way you'd have seen him on the front line or the barricades or anything like that. He would not have been squatting anywhere or anything. He was such an utterly ordinary, everyday type of person. And in some ways, this was very deliberate, because what he was trying to tell people, he was people used to call him an intellectual, and he used to reject that. And people thought he was being modest, but no, he was being very, very particular. In his view, his great talent was that he understood anarchist ideas which is fine. That's nice. If you read enough theory books, you can get your head around them. Where the real magic is if you can bring them alive and make them accessible to other people, because anarchism, more than any other kind of political idea, depends on other people actually practicing it, right? Not just believing in it, but living it and doing it and breathing it. So Colin wanted to show people that you didn't have to be a kind of hardcore radical revolutionary. You could be a completely ordinary person. You could have a regular job. You could, I mean, there's wonderful photographs of him, like, 'cause he was an architect's assistant all the time during the 50s when he was doing this radical anarchist journalism. And he goes to suit with his hair in the side parting, 50s style Brill cream, wears a suit, wears a tie, goes into the office, has, pleasant office boy banter about, the boss's wife who makes delicious pies and all that kind of utterly. I mean, you could be reading like Keep the Aspidestra Flying by George Orwell or something. It's so almost a caricature of ordinariness. But within that, what was so compelling was that he just suddenly brings anarchy alive in such a way as it doesn't have to have a particular lifestyle. Suddenly it really is up to you whereabouts in your life, without necessarily having to throw all of the kind of norms and conventions. It's about asking yourself, taking responsibility for what you think's valuable and what you think isn't. And that's probably the big starting point in anarchy. Turning up for your own life, being really conscious, not just going along with something, examining everything and thinking, why am I doing that? And why is it valuable to me? So yeah, and what got me to Colin was that he was very, very boring, in a nice way.
How do you think philosophy, history and politics merge within an anarchist context?
I love this idea. Yes. So one of the people I most admire, the philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend. And Paul Feyerabend famously wrote Against Method, came out about 1973, which put the cat completely among the pigeons, because he talked very much about that anarchic frame of mind that can't bear a disciplinary silo or doesn't want to stick in any one genre. And again, it's this notion of there being two ways that you can undermine power and break it down and break it up. You can confront it head on, which, yeah, you need to do that, but that can be extremely dangerous and very frustrating. But the other thing you do is you just drown it out with lots of other possibilities. So he was a wonderful pluralist, was Paul Feyerabend, and he argued that the history of science and practice of science has for too long suffered from the fact that it stays in its very rigid little silos, this subdiscipline or that subdiscipline. So he advocated, let 1,000 flowers bloom, be creative, do not be dishonest, but be creative and experimental. And so for me, those trio of subjects because they're obviously my most beloved subjects, and I could never choose between them, so I just plonked myself on the intersection with a good dose of sort of drama and literature in there too. But to me, history and philosophy have always been very interchangeable for me, because I like the kind of analytical discipline of philosophy, but what that always misses for me is the fact that things constantly change. Ideas, time, it's constantly dynamic and it's constantly pluralistic. So if you do very, very classical, standard analytical philosophy, you actually end up losing a lot of that pluralism and dynamism. So history was my way of doing philosophy, because it put the movement back in and it put the difference back in. So suddenly you can't do history without realizing how many different but equally valid perspectives there are on any single one event. It's that classic thing, you've all done it in college or whatever. If there's an accident and 6 witnesses, you're going to get 6 different accidents, and that to me is not something you need to tidy up. It's something you need to kind of embrace and understand that is what life is. So those two, and then with the politics, again, it's that in any equation, look where the power is, look what it's doing. So yeah, to me, those three all kind of swirl around in a kind of glorious, hopefully quite productive chaos.
Sometimes I look at it as, look at where the express psychopath is. Sometimes.
Yeah. Be alert for the psychopath, definitely.
Your educational background is in history and philosophy. The risk with academic circles is that it can be a rigid environment where ideas outside of conformity can be labelled outdated or can simply get lost in a bubble of elitism whose vested interest is to hold on to power no matter the cost. Also, academia can become strictly an intellectual endeavour which fails to embody and implement input that helps shape the world in a direction towards organic freedoms. Karl Marx said, "Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." Do you think academia has an important part to play in providing validity to anarchist theory, which is often outright dismissed?
It's a really hot topic right now because especially as universities are facing quite a lot of trouble at the moment. I mean, we are looking at a situation, every time you listen to the news, it seems that there are funding cuts and student fees are just astronomical. And then students are quite rightly kind of looking at the money they're paying on the one hand and then counting the number of hours that they're actually seeing people on the other. And then, it is right now, it's going through a complete perfect storm. And in some ways, it's doing that, not because these aren't ideal times for kind of higher and advanced and certainly that kind of university style education, which is differentiated from other kinds, from training or just knowledge acquisition, because what university education, what was always at the heart of it was sort of two things: the element of moral inquiry, always not just what but why and how come, and that's sort of, and very closely related to that, the general kind of reflectivity, this idea of not just accepting an idea on its own terms, but being able to criticize it, look at it from different angles, even dare to imagine there might be alternatives to it. Those are the real kind of things which to me were aspects really worthwhile and valuable in the idea of the university. The extent to which that has actually been a reality is probably much more contestable. At the end of the day, universities, I mean, as you said in your very well phrased question, universities are elite institutions. I mean, they were created to prop up an establishment, first the church, and then later the kind of government, the civil service training and the professions, which were all part of an extended establishment, law, and entering into politics and what have you. And now increasingly they face to the market, because that is a sort of backbone for our society in a kind of sort of neoliberal context. But nevertheless, it's always the same thing. Spaces like universities are never one thing or the other, because you cannot deny that, some truly incredible thinking gets done in this space, because it is a space supposedly dedicated to that activity, the activity of thinking. And where else in life are we, especially right now when everything goes at such a manic pace, and probably fairly deliberately, let us not have a moment's pause. Let's not have a moment's reflection. Let us just bombard ourselves constantly with, let's face it, fairly low quality crap. Let's fill ourselves up and desensitize ourselves, because goodness me, if we stopped to think what was going on, we'd probably have a full-scale rebellion on our hands. Now, anarchists have always had a bit of a kind of edgy relationship with the academy. Certainly not too many of the sort of classic anarchist thinkers have been anywhere near the academy, but in some ways, figures like Kropotkin, Proudhon, Emma Goldman, people like that's historically not completely unusual. I mean, all kinds of dissenting thought, whether it was even figures like John Stuart Mill, that classic kind of, certainly not particularly anarchist and definitely not particularly Marxist, but because, he's a sort of very kind of ardent, perhaps social liberals, the term. But again, all of these sort of traditions of any kind of dissent have strong roots outside of the academy. Nevertheless, that was then. And right now, the academy is one possible space where critical thinking may theoretically happen. So it is important. It is a very important player, particularly at this moment in time. Now, if we're going to say that what academics ought to be doing is looking at the world and thinking about, is our current body of knowledge sufficient for understanding the problems that we're facing? And if it's not, what kind of things do we need to know? What kind of questions do we need to ask? And we are entering a time when a lot of the old ways that we used to analyze problems or devise solutions, we are seeing time and time again that they don't work with the kind of problems we're facing. we're facing things like something like climate change, for example, doesn't fit your standard kind of problem. It's both local and it's global simultaneously. It's got multiple factors involved in it. It involves multiple stakeholders, and it's not going to finish. It's not going to be solved. We're going to have to learn to live with it. And living with it means that we have to constantly keep adapting as the climate changes and adapts, and it's going to be almost impossible to predict that entirely. So we have a kind of structure of a problem that our knowledge isn't geared up for. So right now, universities ought to be working overtime and being as anarchic as possible in the Paul Feyerabend sense, because it's not just that our knowledge isn't up to scratch, but the kind of questions we're asking at the moment is not going to produce the right sort of responses. And by right sort of responses, I mean responses that are going to help us deal or tackle with things in a meaningful way, that are going to take away the worst effects and amplify the possibilities. So yeah, universities need to be a lot more anarchic, but something tells me they probably aren't planning on that.
The hierarchical structural research and publishing format in academia recently changed, I believe. What was the aftermath of removing the gatekeepers, and can this be seen as a positive example of anarchy in action?
I think what you're referring to is that some of the kind of pressure around publication rankings and what have you, there was quite a strong internal movement, and I certainly noticed it on several, among several institutions, to very clearly say, when people were listing their kind of publications, like, we're going to do this on the value and the context of your work and the research. We're not just going to pull out a list of ranked journals. We're not going to do it by numbers anymore. There was pushback on that. I don't think it's entirely been erased, but I think it just goes to show that is actually, I think you're quite right. I mean, it is an example that, that totally came from within, that just sense of something being so completely outrageous and completely contradictory and counterproductive to what a lot of people were trying to achieve. And there was, kind of universities did push back on that. And that's a really hopeful sign, because it shows that, even in supposedly quite, sort of bleak, dire, very stressed and stretched times, that there's still scope for cooperative spirit and action. Another example, which was, I think, really important, was the open access. I mean, that again was a very sort of grassroots initiative. It actually came quite, in conjunction with Open Society Foundation, but it's been something that universities have increasingly embraced. And actually, it's sort of it's actually amazingly, it's really radically changes, kind of the whole sort of hierarchical infrastructure. Just a tiny move like that. For example, I published my first book, we've mentioned it, The Histories of Raphael. I did it open access via a university press. The Australian National University Press gave me the open access option. And so immediately that sort of, that changes things. It's not behind a paywall. People can access it anytime they want, totally for free. And that sort of, to me, as a kind of recently graduated PhD, sent a really strong, clear message that I'm doing this research for others. Therefore, it should be out there. It should be accessible. That just is a complete sort of culture change. So, yeah, I think there are some really hopeful signs.
You have said that the education system, whilst you were growing up, didn't jive with you. The UK has come a long way in terms of progress when it comes to catering to individual child's needs, and also eliminated the rampant institutional violence of the day meted out within the power dynamics of teacher to pupil. Do you think the schooling system, when done wrong, contributes to the indoctrinations of minds rather than expanding it? And would you agree with anarchist critique that the state likes it very much to be kept this way?
Well, yes, I absolutely would. I think actually it's interesting, isn't it? I do quite a few different kinds of interviews, and what people think are the other sort of top hot areas we need to focus on. We need to stop wars, and we've got to deal with climate change and all that sort of thing. And another element of anarchism is that quite often anarchists get very obsessed about the design, that if we can just have this procedure or this social arrangement or this format, we'll get rid of conflict, of power abuse, all this sort of thing. But for me, and I've sort of spent a long time thinking about this, I sort of was thinking about it intuitively as a young person who did find school incredibly hard and a place where it was impossible to flourish, to even really breathe. I had a very strong visceral reaction to being in that kind of space. It felt incarcerated, it felt claustrophobic, it felt inhibited, and still quite sort of has the power to sort of affect me when I think about it too much. But so I sort of listen with half an ear to all these great designs for how you could do things better. But actually, I just sort of think, no, because again, anarchy actually has, I think, without necessarily being idealistic, but it has more interest and faith in humans' ability, not necessarily to be angelic, but to be creative and to be inventive than that. And therefore, to me, it all starts, the nuts and bolts, with, if we've got those capacities and they're within us, we've got the capacity. It's not an inevitability, but we've got the capacity to be creative, to be cooperative, to find ways out of situations that don't rely on force or coercion. But like anything, it's something, any capability, like I can walk or I can run, but I can't, so if I wanted to do that really well, I'd need to train or need to practice. That's what education is. It's sort of education, the idea of that as a kind of a training or an exercise program for your imagination, your mind, your social ability, all that sort of thing. And so I find myself thinking, like, education is often a sort of slightly nudge to the margins in the face of all these huge, great, big global challenges. And yet for me, it's the most catastrophic thing that's happening right now. What is going on in schools, in the academy system, it's horrifying. And what's worse is, it's like education is one of those subjects you have to automatically assume that it is one of life's great goods, and it's almost impossible to criticize it or question it without people thinking you're some sort of monster, or you're some sort of member of a kind of crazy, hardcore neo-traditionalist right-wing homeschooling movement that wants to teach creationism or something like that. And I can assure you, I'm none of those things. But I think what the school system, the great virtue of comprehensive education has been to make it obedience training kind of a sort of statutory requirement for everybody. And if you can't fit into that model or that mold, then you are written off. You are written off. I mean, and that is a psychological scarring that no matter what other very brilliant people come along later, like the Open University or something like that, and try and restore people's confidence and open the world back up to them, what young people go through from literally 5 to 18 within that system is so controlling, so conformist, and so repressive that I think, to be honest, I would say that's probably one of our greatest problems that we have right now, and we happily ignore it.
You're a historian that has chosen anarchism as the best way to organise. What have you come to understand about history that has affirmed your political theory?
Well, I mean, in some ways, so historians, they're a funny group of people, and that's why I really enjoy being among them, because some have a great fondness and tendency of seeing patterns in history. This was particularly sort of the favourite game of kind of philosopher historians in the 19th century who like to kind of see great evolutionary patterns unfolding, usually in the direction towards progress. Well, strangely enough, the only person who persists with the idea that we're heading to progress is Steven Pinker, who is a psychologist, not a historian. I think that's a sort of interesting and provocative argument. But I'm of the historical school which says, I think what history prepares you for, it's a sort of letting go of control in one sense, whilst also a better equipping yourself, gaining a greater kind of self-poise in another. Let me explain that very bizarre comment. The more you study history, and not just history as in what happened when, but also just as a discipline, like when you continually ask yourself, why am I doing it? Why am I asking that question but not this question? Whose voice have I have I acknowledged and whose have I not? Because you're constantly having that dialogue in your head, whilst at the same time shuffling between these different sources, like what's in the archival record? How does that differ from what people remember about something if you happen to be a modern historian like I am? How do you sort of contrast that with kind of statistical or data information? Like, because you're integrating so many different kinds of knowledge, and you're having to acknowledge the limits of all of that activity at the same time. So what you end up with is just this sense of, yes, things are gloriously complex. There is no singular point of view. There is no platform or vantage point. You have to be content with much more kind of provisional comments. You can say, well, it was probably more like this, or this is a more likely scenario. And it's strange, but actually that is something that culturally, actually think in most disciplines, any discipline really, done with that degree of rigor and passion and care, you get the same thing. I mean, the sciences would be classic for saying, well, this is our provisional finding. And yet somehow that's become disconnected from a culture which much more craves and reveres certainty. And of course it does, because if you think about, well, again, put your anarchist lens on, where's the power in the room, or where's the psychopath in the room? Certainty allows us to predict things, and prediction gives us control, and control allows us to kind of wield, is a kind of coercion or a force that we can wield over people, particularly when we've set the pattern and we then control the pattern, right? So there is, this is your kind of classic Michel Foucault kind of theory of the power of knowledge, and who gets to sort of constitute the patterns, and who then gets to control them, and who then sort of gets to sort of put their kind of impress or their mark over what constitutes reality. So I think history obviously there's a way of doing history which completely complies to that, completely does. But for me, history's always been quite liberational in the sense that it's always resisted that. And we talked a bit about the history workshop movement, which was what I looked at with Raphael Samuel. And in some senses, these similar sorts of arguments were coming through, because it had been the case that, what you did was you opposed the liberal account of history, which sort of says, oh, everything's heading in the right way for the better, and this is civilization, everything's progressing, and these people are at the top because they have merit and all that sort of thing. And you kind of counterpose that with the Marxist account of history, which says, well, actually, history is a kind of sort of a continuing cycle of struggle, and we're reaching a point where it's going to be sort of catastrophic confrontation between the classes, and then this, the collision of that will yield a new and more substantial and substantiating reality. And what Raphael and the people around him they had a bit of a kind of crisis of historical competence, because that narrative just didn't work anymore. So what History Workshop does is it says, right, well, maybe history's got a different political function. That's why I thought, this was a very sort of rich breeding ground for my kind of approach to anarchy. On the one hand, history is a really great way of confronting power and calling it out and showing it's not inevitable, that actually it didn't get there because it was the best thing that happened, or it's sort of an evolutionary kind of justified by being an evolutionary force or anything like that. That actually it got there by killing people, by crushing them, by marginalizing them, by accident, by cheating, by, kind of all these sorts of less honorable and noble ways that power kind of perpetuated and survived. But then the other thing that the History Workshop was an incredibly joyful thing. It wasn't just about criticizing power. It was also about showing the incredibly rich seams of life that history had hitherto been ignoring, like the lives of women, the lives of children, the lives of working class communities, the lives of Black people, all these, or the lives, what migrants working, what, itinerant workers, what were they doing, these just revealing whole other worlds of meaning and possibility, which you don't need to resolve that into one single theory of everything. It's actually rich enough just to know, for me, exciting enough to know that there isn't one theory.
We can all see when violent authority exerts its power. Can you describe what authority overreach can look like in its more subtler forms, in ways that Orwell and Aldous Huxley wrote about, which now has become popular culture?
Sure. I mean, well, obviously, so the classic kind of anarchist view, which was actually first written by a guy who wasn't quite an anarchist, but was certainly a fellow traveller, a guy called Randolph Bourne. And he said, war is the health of the state. Because what he meant by that is war is like the most classic, obvious sign that the state is healthy. And, this is in some ways kind of a sort of a product of the very political philosophy that we've just been discussing, the lingering kind of faith in a myth about the origins of power. And this idea, whether you go from a kind of Thomas Hobbes perspective that says, right, well, the state of nature left to our own devices was so violent and horrible to us that the only way to solve this is to grant, a Leviathan, a powerful force, ultimate power over all of us, and therefore we'll be safer. So then you're in this sort of slightly tortuous logic loop where you say, right, well, we've got to give the state ultimate power, and the ultimate being the capacity to command the forces for war, in order to stop us being violent to each other. In order to be protected from war and from violence, we need to have the constant threat of war or violence. You see where I'm going with this? It doesn't quite make sense. Equally, you could, have a more positive spin, or we need authority in order to make positive progress. But in order to make progress, we need to use judicious amounts of force. So that's when you get your notions of just war, or, the sort of at what point kind of violent intervention is justified or warranted in the name of the larger kind of humanitarian project, as it were. Now, these are the really obvious forms, like everyone can spot this is power in action. But in order to get to that point, and I think actually Wendy Brown, a fantastic political thinker from America, she's sort of really nailed this well. But in order to get to that point, we're all actually living in a state where, let's face it, we're never really at peace. We're just not obviously at war. So there's this kind of constant state of inactive warfare that's sort of happening kind of almost constantly. And it goes back, trickles right down, not just through simple things like, let's take it to level 2, which was when the pandemic hit, for example. This country is a democracy, defines itself as such by the fact the majority of people have civil liberties. But the minute a situation arose which the government could claim, I'm not, I hasten to add, I was fully up for shielding and not going out and having vaccinations. I'm not sort of saying anything about the particular choices there, but all I'm trying to flag is that the minute something like that hit, it was incredibly easy, as it always is, for those civil liberties gone. And, it's not just that, but those moments also open up opportunities for a lot of other legislation to hurtle through very, very quickly, sometimes not even following their own due processes. And we certainly have that situation now. We are living through times of absolutely unprecedented levels of legislation, bureaucracy, absolutely everything. So it's like level 2, because that's still pretty obvious. We can feel the power going on there. But then I think level 3, and to me, this is the most dangerous, because at the end of the day, if people can see power and people can see the effects of it, and it's not particularly great or positive, and it's kind of crushing and foreclosing everything that they feel and how they want to live their life. Okay, so after a while, people will tolerate so much, and after a point, it starts to get actually genuinely quite dangerous as tempers begin to fray and people feel that they've got less and less to lose. So what is it that keeps us obedient? Well, it comes back to what we were just discussing earlier, our fantastic 5 to 18 year obedience training course that we all go on, basically. And we have to go on if we want to have any chance of any kind of success in this life, and we're not stinking rich. That's it. If I hadn't taken my GCSEs, my A levels, even university, I had to toe lines which I would in any other walk of life or state of mind question. So that's how power operates. It's not just, and this is, as I mentioned, Wendy Brown, this is the point she makes really spectacularly well. And it also leads from similar things like we've mentioned, figures like Michel Foucault, and that understanding that power is very sinewy, it's sneaky. It's not just, in some ways it distracts us with its really obvious forms. I mean, whenever any politicians in any kind of problems or crisis, it's the easiest thing in the world to go and find and have a war somewhere, right? And we're seeing this in grisly, horrendous Technicolor from Benjamin Netanyahu right now. But, Maggie Thatcher did it with the Falklands too. Let's, oh dear, things are looking a bit dicey. I know, let's go and have a war. So I don't wish to sound flippant because wars are terrible, awful things. People get hurt needlessly. But it is a strategy. And it's a strategy that helps us not look or not start becoming conscious of all the other ways power is sort of circling and ensnaring us in different spaces.
Post-war Britain saw Minister of Health Erin Bevan, backed by Labour Party leader Clement Attlee, come to power and created a comprehensive welfare state with the establishment of the National Health Service, giving free healthcare to all British citizens, and other benefit reforms such as social housing. Social policy affects us all. The red in the red and black anarchist flag is the socialist values to uphold because no man is an island. The anarchists acknowledge that a form of infrastructure is important.
So, I mean, the welfare state's one of our big myths that we have. You can't question it. It's just an unquestionable good. It's a good thing. Like comprehensive education, it's a good thing. Why? Because it extends the resources and the goods to more people. And of course, what anarchists come along and say, yes, but doesn't that come with almighty conditions, right? It's like the whole concept of self-governance in the colonies, and indeed it was not a completely unrelated policy decision because the welfare state was actually the product of conversations that have been going on since the 20s, essentially. And it's this idea that, so we will extend the benefits and the resources and the goods of our society, but in this particular way and in our particular image. And we'll also be able to marshal them for our own particular purposes. So, you suddenly have a system where, because so much the center, the state, is dictating what health looks like, what the criteria for healthy people are, what kind of interventions are appropriate, what education looks like. Admittedly, that came much later with the introduction of formal curriculums in the 80s. But nevertheless, and that power to kind of standardize, on the one hand, it's justified by saying, well, if you don't do that, people end up having such variable experience, and that's not fair to them. And the other kind of in brackets is also that makes it hard to kind of forecast and plan for the market, the needs of the labour market and what have you, which is always, the sort of subtext in any kind of state directive on these subjects. Nevertheless, it sounds like I'm just slamming the welfare state and not recognizing that it was a genuine redistribution, or no, not quite the redistribution that it purports to be, because it actually had a very limited helpful effect to the poorest people in the country and a much more helpful effect to those people who are on the kind of margins, the upper working classes, the lower middle classes. That was the cohort it particularly helped for two reasons. Firstly, it made their incomes, which they did already have, go further because they were able to access more free healthcare and what have you, and they didn't have to spend on health insurance policies, private health insurance policies or anything like that. And it also created jobs. It created a whole strata of professional jobs, which people, the bright children of the working classes were able to go and become teachers, become social workers and all that sort of thing. Sorry, I realise that your question was broader than just my views on the welfare state. Nevertheless, one of the big problems of the welfare state was that it was designed with the 30s in mind, and therefore it was almost the culmination of what would have been brilliant to do in the Victorian period. What it didn't anticipate was the world we're moving into, and now we're looking at a situation where it's in absolute and complete crisis. Now, there would have been one very simple way to do this in terms of the anarchist structure organization question. The biggest thing I'd love people to kind of take away about anarchism is that all those myths about, everything's just got to be in total chaos all the time. No, anarchists are against permanent power infrastructures. They are, it's a very centrifugal, it's a very kind of movement-based mindset. It's a way of saying anytime you let things settle too much or get into too fixed a routine or a pattern, that's when power starts to fester. You need to constantly change and adapt. And so it's not a problem that you have things like hospitals or organizations, workplaces, anything like that. It's a problem that they're run in the same way by the same pattern all the time. And people don't have the freedom to decide and genuinely implement what's right for their space and their communities. And we saw that absolutely loud and clear during the pandemic again, that, it would have been much healthier and effective and efficient. It would have saved lives if people had been able to have much more direct and immediate and meaningful control over the places and spaces that they work in. So I suppose what I'm saying is the welfare state. Well, for a start, there's no such thing as a welfare state. The state doesn't care about your welfare. It cares about remaining in power, and it cares about controlling you. But a welfare infrastructure is a fantastic idea for the reasons you said, in that it extends the goods and gives more people a meaningful shot at a decent quality of life. But what's not okay is when it's controlled from a central power.
We have had Brexit, and what Tony Benn's anti-EU stance would fall under Lexit. But what is the anarchist critique of big organisations such as the EU? Is it at odds with direct democracy?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a really interesting thing. In some ways, anarchy's got this amazing ability to wiggle its way into everybody else's ism, basically. You can have a kind of anarchic account of liberalism, and you can have an anarchic account of conservatism. Finally, you genuinely can. And what's striking is that in both, like, things like the European Parliament and the European Dream was very much taking a lot of liberal ideas and trying to kind of institutionalize them and turn them into sort of real concrete realities. So one very classic liberal idea is that, because obviously at the heart of liberalism, everyone ought to have, is the individual and civil liberties. And that's something certainly a lot of anarchists get on board with. In fact, you could just say they take that to its logical conclusion. And what liberals do is kind of fall over themselves by saying, oh, well, in order for everyone to be free, we all need to have these sort of centralized sort of power hubs which control how that freedom's going to go, because otherwise no one will be free. And it's a sort of, again, we get into these sort of fairly torturous and problematic cycles of reasoning. Now, something like the European Parliament, the notion, is that how we prevent conflict, the basic principles are actually, I think, completely right. We prevent conflict by entangling our interests and distributing power. So, it's a game of how can we ensure no one's ever going to have enough force to literally, it's a sort of physical move that you make. You can ensure that can summon enough force to wreak catastrophic conflict upon the world, or that you've distributed everyone's kind of investment and interest so finely that you can never get those big, that's the ideal. You don't get those big power blocks emerging. That's what you're trying to achieve now. And as it goes, it sort of hasn't managed to achieve that. And you entangle everyone's interests through economic relationships, through cultural relationships, and through political forms of political alliance that are not just military. All those ideas are great, but again, it's the same problem as with liberalism in general. And that is that it keeps relying on these state or these authoritative mechanisms in order to achieve that. And all that happens is you kind of go halfway down the track. You create these sort of mid-size institutions. So European Parliament, it's not a world governance institution, it's Europe. And it sort of is never managed to get, and even then, what that actually means is it's the kind of sum of the member states that make it up. And so because they're reliant on that model, that really does paralyze what you can do as a sort of common kind of European identity. There is something intrinsically paradoxical about thinking we need this Leviathan called Europe in order to kind of enjoy an appropriate amount of liberty. So what's the anarchist view on the European Parliament? Well, it's got a lot of good ideas that we could borrow, but what we don't want to do is institutionalize.
On to freedom of speech and cancel culture. You've said we could think about exercising a moral conscious practice as a permanent result. How can we think about alternative conflict resolution with human interaction?
Well, I'm sympathetic. I'm going to say straight up front, think that for young people today who have been through a really hideous, very oppressive school system, if they show any spark of life and any sort of desire to object to things that they find abhorrent, I'm sympathetic. And frankly, a lot of the things that get cancelled, well, a lot of the individuals in question, let's be brutal, they're big enough and rich enough to live with that, you know. So on the other hand, having cancel culture is just an option or a thing you can do in society. It's always a bit, it's not, it doesn't sit naturally or correctly with me, because I do think, you know, free speech is the absolute nuts and bolts of how we discover each other and how we kind of create new kinds of understanding between each other. So I differentiate between saying understanding why people would want to do that, but sort of thinking, well, what kind of conditions would it be, do we need for them not to want to do that? And I think right now we're dealing with such utterly relentless and repugnant, kind of aggressive, sort of angry kind of messages coming at us from all directions, that, you know, that sort of equal militancy to not hear them and not listen to them and not engage with them. I'm very, very sympathetic with that. So I guess I've got no easy answer for this, except that I can imagine a better situation being, or an attempt to try and navigate that, by saying, I do think we need to listen to views, even views that shock and horrify us, because they're not going away. Just because we cancel them, they're still there. And actually, that collision, you know, if we're brave enough to do it, it's going to show us something about the extent of who we are right now. But that said, it is, you know, it is an incredibly hard thing to ask people to hear some of the kind of degrees of aggression and violence that are out there right now. So
is democracy prone to fail under this hierarchical system, and why isn't it as simple as voting ourselves out of this mess?
Honestly, we really never have done democracy. We have something that is a proper noun that calls itself democracy, capital D. And actually, that's the name for a system by which we are kind of, again, given this sort of doping medicine to make us think that we've got so much choice in who's leading us and what they do. But I mean, it's actually on every single level completely untrue. It's not even that we can have free choice over, oh, here are the things that really matter to us, and here are the things we think ought to be on the agenda, because the parties will set that for us. So it's like, literally, here are all the issues we think are important, and this is what we're going to do about them, and they're what you should care about. And they're almost like they never correspond to what people actually care about, what really actually just spontaneously and instinctively moves people and wants them to kind of connect with something. So we don't have democracy. But I think it's also valuable to know that, you know, yeah, it's not unimportant that still, just about in this country, you can speak reasonably freely, and express yourself and move about and live in ways that it is not possible to do in other places. So again, I'm sort of trying to steer a kind of pathway between being really hardline and critical, which I kind of like to be, but also recognizing that we are in really perilous times right now. And so actually we could use this, what we do have, the skerrigs of freedom left to us, we can use those as springboards or departure points, or things where we, you know, like we can say, okay, right, well, this is actually something, I can do something with this. I've got, you know, something I can start with. For me, democracy is always about dealing with, you know, kind of the facts of who's in the room with you at any given point. So you can do democracy instantly. It's not something we have to wait for. We could literally just do it right now. It's democracy happens whenever you just take whoever you're in a space with as an equal decision maker to you, and that, you know, someone that has an equal stake, and they're also a kind of social fact, right? So how they see the world is a fact, which is a separate fact from whether or not the world conforms to that. But what people believe, what people feel, these are pieces of social information which are all part of our decision-making environment. And democracy is not necessarily, we always think of it as the outcome. Oh, it's the decision we make at the end. No, it's that process of discovering what's out there. And you know, it's that process of discovering who the social is as much as how it should be.
The empire model is destructive, as is the corporate, both brutal exploitative practices. We are familiar with those. But now we're in an age of techno-feudalism. But the anarchist way remains unwavering in the analysis of power. It's prolific capital growth versus egalitarian decision-making wherever possible, and certainly transparent. Advocates of fascism still remain in large parts of the political mindset world and claim fascism is an efficient way to organise. Never mind all the harm it does. Fascism gets things done, they say. What would be the anarchist argument against this? Why are we anti-fascists?
Well, fascism, because it is just like the kind of, it's the caricature of power. It's the engorgement of power. I mean, an anarchist thinker, Alex Comfort, in a very similar kind of vein to what Hannah Arendt consequently sort of went on to say, sort of thought about totalitarianism as a uniquely kind of, it's like, kind of all the power distortions that are embedded within our concept of modernity and modern politics sort of blown up. It's almost, so we're almost looking at kind of cartoon versions of things that are happening on kind of slightly smaller or slightly more palatable scales. Fascism gets things done. Well, I mean, this is interesting, right? And we have, I'm not saying Donald Trump is fascist, but we have an example of someone who is acting in a analogous way, right? So someone who can take decisions, wake up in the morning and act in a way without having to worry about due process. And that's kind of what people are trying to say, right? Like fascism's got much more flexibility. It doesn't have to go through, 20, 100, 1,000 civil servants and reams of bureaucracy and get this committee and that committee and that committee to agree. Someone could just get up and say, this is the problem, this is the solution, bang, we're going to do it. And you can therefore see actually why, if that is the kind of characteristic approach shared by a lot of these kind of right-wing groups that have typically these very strong leader figures, you can see why people might, in this particularly perilous moment that we seem to be living at, that's attractive. And again, it's another critique of a system which has just confused itself so much with all its, having the right instincts to divide power and to distribute it, but then trying to keep control of it all, which is the fundamental undoing of it. And so then it's managed to alienate so many people that having this big figure, it's almost like, it's okay, everyone, it's all the Old Testament God figure or big daddy, if you like, a patriarch's going to swoop in, fix everything, we'll be fine. Only, of course, that totally depends on the amount of time that one individual feels invested in doing that particular activity. It suffers from whimsy and caprice. And the other thing is, how extensive an analysis is this individual going to make? How many points of view, how much complexity, how much plurality are they going to be, one, aware of, B, sensitive to, C, care about? So we'll have our fixes, but they'll be in one person's image. And on the day that you no longer align with that image, tough. Nevertheless, it is telling us something right now about the fact that we are instinctively sensing that we need much more flexible and fluent ways of responding to something. But rather than invest all that power back into a new Leviathan, let's properly disperse it this time and bring it back into ourselves.
We can see how anarchists are historically treated by any forms of power formations. In particular, revolutionary actors like to crack down on those who truly espouse egalitarian models of organising. One case in point is how Vladimir Lenin used communism and the threat of the very real Western imperialist takeover to hold tightly onto power indefinitely. We see this time and time again how anarchist principles are prevented from flourishing to its fullest potential on an international scale. How can we circumvent this usual outcome based on toxic hierarchy? It seems we are trapped on any given ruling class's chessboard and we are its mere pawns.
How are we going to have this revolution though? Yeah, because anarchists got it from both directions, right? Number one, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, so no one in power is going to willingly give anything up. And then if we're too forceful and trying to insist on something, we have to have a vision or an ideal of what that is, and then we fall into contradiction. So we have all the problems from all angles. So what can you do? Well, I think you got to think completely differently about what revolution is. And actually, I mean, this could be because I'm just, sort of pathologically not keen on kind of sort of finding myself in prison or anything like that. I don't want to do that. So I would say that one approach we can think about is by constantly being creative, in the sense that, and quick and nimble on our feet and fluid. So, when we see something that's not working, why not do what Raf Sam did? Invent something, right? He could not find a way of, a sort of outlet for the kind of history he wanted to see. So he invented one. After a while, it became too kind of overwhelmed with infighting. So he moved on and he did something else. And we've always got this in our head. If we don't have the revolution and institutionalize it and make it permanent and fix our procedures and fix our methods, then we've failed. Well, anarchy embraces failure, because failure means that you're going to pop up somewhere else in a different form. So I think, why don't we think about revolution less as this great big epic confrontation followed by a kind of transition to a new sort of settled identity, and just think about it like contagion, like it's, let's take a leaf out of the pandemics, but one positive thing we can take from it, let's just spread, so let's have, everyone do their own small little kind of acts of anarchy wherever they see the opportunity and spread it on. And I think there's something to be said with kind of doing it in a spirit of joy, and we don't have much to be joyful about, but I don't think we should give up on joy. I think it's an incredibly radical sensation to feel joyful.
You've been tuned into the Circle Day on Resonance 104.4 FM with me, Yvette Gerez. You just heard from British anarchist thinker Sophie Scott Brown. Until next time, turn on, tune in and kick off.
Through the best of times, through the worst of times.